welcome to our panel, Sex and Consent in France in 1650, 1802. We were initially a round table of 6 people, but we lost one and then we lost another. So today it's Justine, Mariam, Mita, and myself. Alex will not be coming. And I have to, in fair advertising, Haiti was someone who dropped out a while ago, but just learned about it. So that's still in the title. So that's your intro to our panel. And now let me introduce our first speaker. Justine Semmens is Associate Fellow at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. And she's also a seasonal lecturer at the University of Victoria. She just finished her dissertation last year, Sex Crime Appeals of the Parlement of Paris, 1664 to 1655 with Sarah Bean. It is fantastic. I read it on the plane on the way over, and it's a good read. She's a great writer, and I really encourage you all to take a look. She's working on turning it into a book and has already given several talks on the topic.
Thank you, Lena. In 16th century France, in response to the intensifying influence of patriarchalism in civic and family life, royal legis systematically criminalized formerly religious offenses against marriage. The most influential component of this legal reform, captured in Articles 40 to 44 of the Ordonnance of Loi, involved the reclassification of women's sexual consent as the prerogative of the paterfamilias, or his legal proxy, by construing betrothals contracted without his permission as wrapped by seduction, a crime committed by other men against this privilege. While the explicit text of the Ordonnance asserted that men and women under the age of 25 did not have the legal authority to provide consent to marry, and thus have intercourse, without the express permission of legal guardians, in practice, the lion's share of rapt appeals involved daughters construed as the victims of bribery, deceit, and flattery, who had been seduced into sex through fraudulent promises of marriage. Although legists and jurists initially conceived of seduction as a problem of clandestine marriage, the Parlement of Paris, which is the highest court of appeal in the kingdom, developed a jurisprudence on consent arising from this definition of seduction, which significantly influenced the court's response to other criminalized marital and some non-marital sexual offenses, like bigamy, which will be the subject of my talk today, but also, or like adultery, which is the subject of my talk today, but also bigamy and rape, in ways that might seem surprising to us. In this way, the history of consent, and the multiple definitions of consent that plaintiffs and defendants invoked in adultery trials in particular, provide a rich opportunity to explore not perhaps new stories, but certainly new ways of telling them. At its core, legal conceptions of consent relied on a central tenet of French patriarchalism, that women were sexually subservient to men in ways that did not necessarily, that could, but did not necessarily have to conflate consent with physical willingness or consent with sexual pleasure. Paradoxically, this tenet suggested at once that women who flouted the subservience must be punished or blamed for the disobedience to male authority, and also, at the same time, that women did not always have the authority to consent to their own disobedience, and thus could not be held criminally responsible. The rules on consent varied depending on the relative honor and virtue of the parties involved. These conditions were determined in large part according to metrics of social rank and status, as well as gender. For 16th century parlementaires and the men and women who confronted royal justice, assessing women's consent was a vital component in the process of understanding guilt and blame. In its application, it provided a metric for judges and married men to judge criminal liability that resulted in more nuanced definitions of consent, and I think we often appreciate. To get to this nuance, I'm going to start with a particularly evocative example. So in May 1551, the Parlement of Paris executed the servant of a Parisian barkeep for adultery with his master's wife. According to the parliamentary lawyer who summarized the case, the servant had recently become enamored of the master's wife, a woman whom we are told already had a very dishonorable reputation. One evening, having become too drunk on too much wine, she, and I quote, revealed herself up to the thighs, and a little later showed off her throat and her nipples. Spurred on and heated up by the sight of his mistress's naked body, the servant decided that he wanted to get to know her a little better. Later that evening, while she slept off the wine, he had intercourse with her. Still not satisfied, he had sex with her again. This time she woke up, hearing the sound of her husband's arrival back home from his evening out. She cried out and complained about the servant's behavior. He fled the house. Hearing the clamor, neighbors chased him down and eventually caught him on the Pont au Meunier. After being arrested, the servant eventually confessed to everything. The Parlement sentenced him to hang for adultery, despite the protestations of his master and his mistress, who, and I quote, wanted to save his life and their reputations by declaring that they had not denounced him. Because her husband refused to denounce her, the barkeep's wife eluded prosecution entirely. Besides, we are told, the wife could not be found legally culpable, in part because she was asleep when the assault took place, but also because her husband had left her alone in the house with a male servant in spite of her scandalous reputation. This recollection of the predatory servant and the reluctant, irresponsible husband provides valuable insight into the sexual politics that shaped both the judicial reasoning and the response that some husbands had to their wives in illicit sexual contact with other men. The husband had to try to avoid the publicity of a trial that would expose the scandal that gripped his household, the matter going to trial only because the husband ultimately could not keep the matter a secret. Finally, judicial reasoning held that the wife was not responsible for the sexual encounter, in part because her absent husband had not protected her. It was the husband's job to safeguard the chastity of his wife and manage the integrity of his household. Notions of legal consent, which men provided or prohibited, were integral to the 16th-century prosecution of men for adultery. And at this time, adultery was a very serious moral and criminal offense in the 16th century. Former medieval models of prosecution, which were based primarily on ecclesiastical traditions that emphasized the sinfulness of the offense, permitted both husbands and wives to pursue each other for adultery. However, in the beginning of the 16th century, French jurists began to reform Roman law as a tool to regulate and centralize royal authority. At the time, jurists began to imagine the patriarchal household as the central organizational currency of the state, and families in turn were encouraged to use these centralizing forces to accumulate wealth and status. These legal reforms secularized adultery, among other marital offenses, as a temporal crime as part of this broader cultural process. And in the case of adultery in particular, the inequality of the marital infidelity of husbands and wives before the law rendered adultery as a crime committed by women and their lovers against their husbands. As a result of these changes, which prescribed harsh penalties for adulterous wives and no penalties for adulterous husbands, legal and social historians of France have been justified in predicting that the 16th and 17th centuries should have been a particularly brutal and repressive period for the prosecution of women for adultery. New punishment models included a supposed tolerance for the honor killing of wives and their lovers, judicial execution and secular incarceration in religious houses accompanied by corporal punishment, and the loss of the dowry. But in reality, these more extreme punishments were only reserved for the most wealthy and elite of families. Men of modest and moderate means, like laborers and artisans, represented only a small fraction of plaintiffs in the appeal hearings of adulterous wives in the 16th and early 17th century. In reality, adultery was expensive and embarrassing for husbands to prosecute, and introduced complicated questions about consent that husbands had to navigate before making the decision to bring an adultery accusation to the royal courts. If a husband had the exclusive right and the legal responsibility to control and censure a wife's sexual behavior, at what point was his wife no longer able to legally consent to her own infidelity? And at what point did her husband bear the greater share of the moral responsibility for her behavior? What compelled women to let themselves be seduced by another man? What would neighbors, fellow guildsmen, or patrons think? Was the adultery simply a matter of a wife's treasonous choices? Or would people conclude that her adultery was the inevitable result of his failure as patriarch? Who wore the pants in the household? Was he unable to keep her sexually satisfied? Was he weak, a drunk, heavily indebted, overly permissive? Was he a bad provider who encouraged his wife's wandering eye and emboldened other men to take their advantage? If he failed to act, on the other hand, he was a cuckold, a shameful laughingstock, someone not to be trusted because he had little honor. Accusing his wife would also cost him the price of her imprisonment while waiting trial, and, if she was found guilty, deprive his household of one of its most valuable members. So men had to think very carefully before choosing to initiate criminal adultery proceedings. And accusing a sexual rival of seduction sometimes provided an attractive option by claiming that the adultery was forced. In the winter of 1602, a Parisian baker named Bobinot accused François Tisserand, a German tailor, of bribing his wife for the sum of 36 sous to have sex with him. The baker told the Parlement that he neither punished nor accused his wife of any crime, accusing the tailor alone of adultery for her seduction. The baker made the seduction a matter for neighborhood conversation when he accosted the tailor at the home of a friend and hit him with his rolling pin in anger for the ravishment of his wife. The Parlement condemned the tailor to public whipping and perpetual banishment from the city of Paris. Through his decision to implicate only François Tisserand, Bobinot crafted a narrative of sexual aggression in the royal courts, rendering his wife a victim rather than a willing participant in apparent prostitution, and replacing his own embarrassing role as cuckold with the far more valiant job as defender of his wife's misused chastity. Jurists and legists distinguished several categories of force, or violement d'honneur, that always implied coercion to disobey the will of their guardians, but which did not always imply physical overpowering or violence. These categories were delineated according to the marital and social status of the women involved. 16th-century French law defined illicit coercive sex with a married woman as adultery, and sometimes more precisely as adultery par force. They justified seduction as a valid interpretation of adultery par force by concluding that, and I quote, the wife bears lesser share of guilt when the adultery results from the giving of gifts from a man who, through these gifts, bears the greater burden of responsibility. The hermeneutics that conflated sexual consent with the rights of male guardianship permitted jurists to define other forms of fraud, seduction, or persuasion as a subtle form of violence. Amid cultural anxieties about the social disgrace of cuckoldry, force provided husbands with a legal mechanism to seek public justice that redirected blame away from the household. As the injured party in adultery, a husband had the right to determine if his wife had willingly deceived his trust, and he also had the power to target blame strategically toward her or away from her. So for instance, in 1602, Jacques Martin chose to accuse his wife, Françoise Charpentier, and a man named Etienne Bertrand of committing adultery together, in spite of his wife's protestations that Bertrand had wielded, and I quote, a vile dagger to force her, a Christian woman, to have sex with him. By contrast, in 1589, Jean Prévost justified the murder of his wife's lover by pointing to the criminal intent of the seducer. Hearing a rumor that a man had seduced his wife with a glass of wine, Prévost ran home to confront the interloper. In front of his neighbors who gathered to watch the spectacle, he got all fired up and yelled, "You raped my wife, tu as violé ma femme," as he killed the man who had ravished and seduced his wife with wine in order to have sex with her. As in the case of Bobinot's attack on François Tisserand for seducing his wife with money, Jean Prévost's wife, to whom he attributed no fault, remained safe from Prévost's violence. Prévost interpreted his wife's seduction with wine as rape. Neither Prévost nor legal officials demanded that she stand trial for adultery, though the Parlement had no choice but to convict him of the murder he committed in front of his neighbors. Prévost's compelling story of horror and outraged loss of control convinced the king to grant him remission from execution, an outcome the Parlement might have predicted. Jean Prévost was set free to return to his wife. When Prévost marched home to confront his wife's seducer, a group of neighbors followed him there. Similarly, in front of his neighbors, Bobinot confronted the man who had paid his wife for sex. When the Parisian barkeep stumbled home to find his servant having intercourse with his sleeping wife, neighbors pursued the servant into the streets to drag him before the bailiff. These illicit sexual encounters were public knowledge. They must have been the subject of neighborhood gossip, which had the potential to damage the honor and social credit of the husbands embroiled in the center of them, as men who let their wives drink excessively or who let other men take sexual advantage of them. The publicity of the adulterous encounter would have forced men to take legal action. Between 1564 and 1650, despite legislation that seems to focus blame on punishment for adultery on women, 3/4 of male adultery appellants appeared at the Parlement alone. Husbands and courts placed sole responsibility on these men whom they accused of seducing, bribing, or physically forcing their innocent wives into sexual intercourse. Ultimately, adulterous men, so the lovers, not the husbands, were convicted as the illicit sexual partners of married women. They represented nearly half of all adultery appeals. And whereas the Parlement severely punished only about 13% of convicted adulteresses, usually when there had also been a conspiracy to murder, it sent 37% of men to hang or to the galleys. In 1625, the Parlement abruptly shifted its stance on the permissibility of husbands to invoke seduction or rape of their wives as a legal tool to shield them from prosecution. In the early summer of that year, the Parlement received an appeal from a law student living in Angers who had been convicted of committing adultery par force with the wife of a sergeant while he was a tenant living in the couple's home. According to the sergeant, the student had ingratiated himself to the wife over the previous several months by presenting her with gifts. Then one evening, when they were home alone together, while holding a dagger to her throat, the student raped her with great violence. The husband charged the young man with adultery, and the matter proceeded to trial, where the Prévost court found him guilty and condemned him to death. During the appeal defense, counsel challenged the validity of the legal concept of adultery par force by arguing that rape and adultery were two discrete and contradictory crimes that could not exist simultaneously. Roman law, he insisted it is necessary to accuse and punish the wife as well as he who has committed adultery with her, and the adulterous wife is always punished, albeit less severely. Ultimately, the defense lawyer managed to successfully argue that it was the wife who, in fact, seduced her rapist through accepting the gifts. So, anyway. The reasons for this abrupt about-face at the Parlement in 1625 are unclear. What is clear, however, is that definitions of consent were beginning to shift again, having tangible impacts on prosecution patterns. The number of men who appealed convictions for the rape of unmarried women for adultery with unmarried women after the first quarter of the 17th century declined to almost zero. And it's called a time, and that's where I'm going. Thank you very much.